Okay, I agree with you that strikes did take place, kinetic operations did take place under the Trump administration against Iran, and there are chances that more strikes can take place. But let us also pay attention to the non-material side of the war theater. The war plans, policy statements, diplomatic exchanges, social media statements, choice of words, tones, meanings behind them, and symbolism of it all. I think we'd agree on this, that the material side of the war comes after the non-material side, planning, right? And the non-material side can give clues about the material side, the strikes, kinetic operations, whether war is returning or not. So let us then keep in mind the critical discourse analysis in order to read the non-material side of the war and to find answer to this very question of whether war is coming back or not. Let me also reiterate this, that critical discourse analysis is a scientific method and is not based on assumptions or perceptions. It reads policy, diplomacy, and projects future course of action. So bear with me for the next 10 minutes and I'll walk you through the discursive plan, the entire discursive line of a start of war, escalation, and moving towards agreements. We know that the Trump administration implies aggressive rhetoric, provocation, and a strong psychological pressure, which are prompt on its military and economic might. Let me give you three big examples from Trump's previous administration, and then I will discuss the present situation, which has also passed through at least three different stages of discourse. First, Trump's coercive dealing with Canada. In November 2024, after his election, Trump announced on Truth Social a 25% blanket tariff on all Canadian imports. This exerted immense psychological and economic pressure, putting Ottawa into a serious internal crisis. Consequently, Finance Minister Freeland resigned, causing shockwaves through the Liberal government and revealing deep-seated anxieties about the Trump administration. Subsequently, Trump also added calling publicly Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau the governor of great state of Canada. In discourse theory, this act would be taken as deliberate subversion of Canada's status, linguistically diminishing its sovereignty and portraying it as perhaps a subordinate territory answerable to Washington. Next year, by February 2025, the threat also materialized. Trump administration officially triggered massive trade war, implementing a blanket 25% tariff on majority of Canadian imports and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy and products. Trudeau responded by imposing $155 billion Canadian dollars retaliatory tariffs, and then Trump escalated it, threatening to increase tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum to 50%, which ultimately forced Canada to back down. The immense political damage of war, trade war, and annexation threats forces a historical transition in Canada. We know Trudeau steps aside in March, and a former banker Mark Carney is sworn in as a prime minister. So a year later, in February 2026, Supreme Court of the United States struck down the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and thereby the president's sweeping emergency tariffs, and Trump replaced it with a temporary 10% global import surcharge. This whole episode took 2 years, and we see the escalation and then the intervention of the US internal democratic mechanism in play, checking the presidential powers and addressing the coercive international engagement. Now let's take the case of Greenland, Denmark. After his re-election in November 2024, he revived his 2019 proposal to buy Greenland from Denmark, and the Denmark Prime Minister Frederiksen and Greenlandic officials quickly dismissed the idea as absurd. The Trump administration then cited national security and existential concerns, with Trump claiming Greenland was crucial to the survival of our planet. He argued that it was under immediate threat from Russia and China, and stated that there is quote unquote nothing that they can do about it. Denmark can do about it. So Trump and his key advisors, including Stephen Miller, refused to rule out military action, insisting the U.S. would acquire Greenland one way or the other. On January 17, 2026, he backed his rhetoric with a concrete economic threat, announcing a 10% blanket, a tariff on Denmark and 7 other European nations, starting February 1, 2026. This, he said, would escalate to 25% tariff by June 1, 2026, if there is no complete and total purchase agreement. But by late January 2026, there is a shift from aggressive brinksmanship to a more subdued, managed compromise. The European Union responded consistently, viewing an attack on Denmark as an attack on the entire custom territory. The EU warned of severe sanctions, with a unified European stance and bipartisan opposition in the US Congress, who called the threats against a NATO ally completely inappropriate. The economic burden of pursuing the existential threat thus became, unsustainable. So once the maximum leverage was spent, the Trump administration provided its own rhetorical off-ramp. During a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January, Trump abruptly reversed his position. So the apocalyptic language of annexation was entirely replaced by bureaucratic technical diplomacy. Now let's also take the case of North Korea from 2017 and 18. We see a transition from a terrifying, apocalyptic brinksmanship to a historical diplomatic embrace, between the leaders. At that beginning, Trump had warned that any North Korean provocation would be met with quote unquote fire and fury like the world has never seen before. See the words, we have to keep the words, and you can see that these same vocabulary is being used today as well. So he told the UN that North Korea will be totally destroyed, famously, minimizing the head of the state, Kim Jong-un, to an absurd cartoonish caricature, calling him Little Rocket Man on a suicide mission. But North Korea matched the linguistic terms, calling Trump a mentally deranged U.S. warlord who must be tamed with fire. See, the peak of the discursive escalation occurred at the dawn of 2018 during the famous nuclear button exchange. Once again, Kim Jong-un used his New Year's address to declare that a nuclear button was unstable. And Trump countered it by saying that I have much bigger and more powerful button, and my button works. So the moment the baseline of maximum leverage was firmly established, the apocalyptic discourse was disassembled with staggering speed. At the June 2018 Singapore summit, The political discourse was, dropped, minimized instantly in favor of a promotional or real estate-driven marketing discourse. Trump praising Kim Jong-un as a very talented, smart, honored counterpart, later famously declaring that the two fell in love after receiving beautiful letters. So crucially, Trump began speaking of North Korea through the language of a developer, noting its great beaches and its immense potential for real estate upside if they denuclearized. The term fire and fury phase was, never a literal war plan. It was a linguistic construction of maximum danger through a discourse lens. North Korea standoff proves that the first Trump administration used hyper-bellicose rhetoric as a theatrical, prelude to a business deal. Let's also take the example of Iran, the earlier case, 2018 and 20. We see that the deliberate linguistic construction of an existential crisis to maximize leverage, followed by a pragmatic de-escalation. The conflict began in May 2018 when the United States unilaterally withdrew from a joint comprehensive plan of action, which was about the nuclear plans. Then my Secretary of State Mike Pompeo used 12 sweeping non-negotiable demands that essentially called for the complete dismantling of Iran's original foreign policy and missile system, and Trump calling Rouhani saying that never threaten U.S. Again, or you'll suffer from the fate of likes of nobody else in the history. So you see this, that hyper-bellicose warnings were used as psychological hammer to scare away global corporations, successfully collapsing Iran's gross official foreign reserve from 122 billion down to only 4 billion by 2020 within 2 years. When an assault later on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad took place, the administration also escalated its discourse from economic strangulation to physical elimination. And we see this, that on January 3, 2020, a drone strike killed Major General Qasem Soleimani, and it represented the absolute peak of Brinkmanship. Trump addressed the nation, labeling Soleimani the #1 terrorist anywhere in the world, a monster, and whose terror regime is over. He followed by declaring that the U.S. had targeted 52 Iranian sites, including cultural sites, heritage sites, and that would again strike very fast and hard if Iran retaliated. But Iran retaliated, and within less than an hour, on January 8, 2020, following Iran's retaliatory ballistic missile strikes on Al-Assad air base in Iraq, the coercive rhetoric was, toned down. So, despite a severe response of retaliation from Iran, Trump approached the podium and began his speech with a surprisingly calm bureaucratic statement saying all is well. He mentioned that no American was harmed, observed that Iran appears to be standing down, and swiftly shifted from military options to announce routine economic sanctions. This sudden shift from, destroying cultural sites to all is well exposes the highly transactional nature of escalation. Both sides had, achieved what they needed for domestic consumption. Trump demonstrated unrivaled legality by removing Soleimani, while Iran demonstrated defiance by openly, attacking American air base in Iraq. In international relations theory, these cases also attract Thomas Schelling's Madman Theory, using hyper-bellicose existential rhetoric to establish total dominance before moving towards structured transactional bargaining. Simply put, the theory says this thing, that the madman can extract benefits from other party given his irrational and or dangerous postures. But the theory also posits that the that the danger of encountering a counter madman can be a challenge as well. And at that point, the first party begins to think, to calculate rationally using cost-benefit analysis. So we see this thing in above cases more vividly in case of Kim Jong-un, and also in case of Iran, but also in case of Denmark, where the seven European nations began to do naval exercises in the Arctic, challenging Trump, and Trump was really irritated by that. Now let's come to the current U.S.-Iran standoff and the likelihood of the war coming back. It is already visible if we engage the critical discourse analysis in this historical context of different cases that we discussed, that there is a shift in rhetoric of the Trump administration from February 2026 to May 2026. And it is a classic example of strategic transition from maximum escalation to coercive bargaining. So the transition has visible phases, the three phases I would like to mention. The first phase, beginning in early March 2026, is marked with powerful rhetoric of unconditional surrender. Following the major escalations of the conflict and death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Trump administration's initial stance completely rejected traditional diplomatic compromise, opting instead for zero-sum demands. Trump demanded on Truth Social on March 6, 2026, there will be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. Trump also openly, called for installing new Iranian leadership, regime change, and that would be, the new one would be perhaps acceptable to the West. By April, we see the second phase starting, and that takes the rhetoric to its maximum level. Trump, so the curve is going up, okay, discursive curve. Trump resorting to, for example, existential threats, which even raised the speculation of use of nukes. The U.S. also tightened its blockade of Strait of Hormuz, and Iran keeps on resisting. Administration resorts to overt threats of civilizational and infrastructural disruptions and attacks. So this phase used maximalist physical intimidation to shock Iranian regime into submission, and the statements used were like, we are going to bring them back to the Stone Age where they belong, or Pete Hegseth on X saying bomb them back to Stone Age. Donald Trump again saying somewhere else, maybe Truth Social, a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. These statements were, were a deliberate deployment of existential threat as a political instrument by explicitly, threatening a population of 90 million people and a multi-millennial, civilization, Iran. The Trump administration sought to completely break Iran's psychological resolve. But soon we see that on April 8, 2026, a temporary truce brought about by Pakistan was implemented, and the language starts to transform almost instantly from apocalyptic threats to bureaucratic, conditional, pragmatism. This marks the third phase now, which moves the parties towards structured parameters of diplomacy. And in this phase, we see the statements like Trump saying Iranian 10-point proposal is a workable basis, on which to negotiate. Again, saying, quote unquote, they want to make a deal and we are willing to make a deal. So this drastic shift from annihilation to workable basis demonstrates the transactional nature of the administration's diplomatic overtures. The hyperbole of phase two only served as a kind of instrument intended to forge more leverage needed for the phase three negotiations. So the current language relies heavily on structured parameters like You would be hearing now memorandum of understanding, phased truces, conditional sanctions relief, technical enrichment caps, multilateral maritime frameworks, and so on. The Trump administration, views military power not just as a tool for operations abroad, but as a coercive psychological leverage to get negotiations done. It follows a strict cost benefit approach as well. It aims to maximize pressure to unsettle its opponents, seek quick transactional victories, and avoid prolonged military engagements. So, to conclude this critical discourse analysis, the pattern is quite visible, moving toward a long term peace. Across multiple theaters that we discussed from his previous administration, North Korea 2017, economic and territorial squeezing of Canada and Greenland in 2025, or the intense 2026 war with Iran, Trump administration consistently utilizes a three-stage discursive cycle. This cycle is, built to manufacture absolute asymmetric power out of thin air, shifting geopolitical reality from a state of existential terror to a structured transactional diplomatic settlement. So we expect and we can project that peace and it's not war that is coming back. A regional order has already been born. A new world order has also been born, and there is going to be a more multilateral world and multilateralism as a new normal that we are going to see in the future. And let me finish with this, that three-stage discursive cycle begins with bellicose, rhetorical, existential threats, moving towards more existential infrastructural threats, and even at times attacks or tariffs, and then it's the transactional bargaining that takes place toward the end. So this is the way Trump administration has carried out its diplomacy, and we now can very much see that we have entered the third phase of transactional bargaining for peace.